The Clear Light of Day, Part 6. You remember we left Esme in the chapel at Wiles Green, where they were just about to start their service for Good Friday. They sang the Passion hymns of mourning and told again the terrible story of Christ's betrayal and agony. And this year, as every year, despite the resolute habits of ordinary cheerfulness that conditioned their lives, the dark narrative took them down with itself into the eerie, dank silence of the tomb. It was right to remember, Esme thought as she reflected on it, but right also to restore people afterwards with the conviviality of a chapel tea. This annual event was well supported by the chapels in the circuit and was an important highlight of the year for Wiles Green. Eventually, having circulated well and spoken to almost everyone, and having thanked the ladies in the kitchen, Esme slipped away to her car, parked out on the road where others could not box it in. Home to finish my Easter sermon, she said to herself. But she knew she wasn't going home quite yet. She could have driven out along Chapel Lane, down the way back to South Harbour, but instead she drove into the village, as far as the old police house, where she drew up, parking carefully to keep well out of the way of passing traffic, but leaving enough space for any pedestrians to get by on the inside as well. For a moment she sat in the car, undecided, unwilling to intrude where she felt unwelcome, and aware that such a short time had gone by since last she had called in. She put her hand on the keys, still in the ignition, almost went to turn them and fire the engine again, but instead took them out and got out of the car. The cottage had all the enchantment of her first visit. She hesitated on the path, wondering whether to knock at the front door, choosing instead to follow the way round to the backyard and the workshop. As she came round the house, she heard the clank and scrape of metal on stone, and coming round the corner into the yard, she found Jabez squatting on the ground, brushing clean the underneath of a rotary mower that lay on its side in front of him. He didn't look up at first when Esme said hello. For a few seconds he continued brushing the odd corners and the bottom of the engine without speaking. Esme began to wonder if he'd heard her when he said, "You're back. Welcome. I can well do with a second pair of hands in a moment when I'm sharpening these blades." He glanced round at her briefly. "Unless you'd rather not. You're not really dressed for stripping down a lawnmower." Esme smiled. "I'd like to help," she said, perching on the edge of a kitchen chair standing out in the yard. She felt a bit self-conscious in her clerical collar and her neat black skirt, but was pleased to be not entirely superfluous. She watched Jabez lay aside the brush and reach for the metal key to undo the nut holding the blade in place. "You've got to have it turned this way so the oil doesn't run into the carburettor," he remarked, as he laid the blade aside with the nut carefully placed beside it and began to loosen the sump plug under the engine. "Been at church?" He shot a glance of friendly inquiry at her as he got to his feet and lifted the lawnmower upright over a battered enamel pudding basin to bleed away the old oil. "Yes," she said. "It's Good Friday." He looked at her. I do know, he said. I thought about you in the service. He had an old glass meat dish handy for his next task, which was flushing out the sump, after which he set the machine on the ground again and squatted down to dismantle the air filter attached to the carburettor on the side of the engine. Excuse me a minute, he said, and carried the outer gauze of the filter in through the open door of his kitchen. She could hear him at the sink, not far within the door, the tap running and scrubbing, the tap running again, and then he re-emerged, patting it dry with a dish towel, and propped it against the house wall at an angle so the air could finish the drying. He blew the dust off the cardboard section of the filter and set it aside with the gauze, and then, moving light and quick, he crossed the yard to his workshop, from where he returned with a big box wrench for the spark plugs. As he bent over the machine, examining the plugs, he remarked, I sit in the porch sometimes and listen to the hymns, even to the service in the summertime if they leave the doors open. I don't come in, but I sit in the porch sometimes. He cleaned off the carbon deposits carefully, fishing in the back pocket of his trousers for a piece of fine sandpaper to rub everything clean. Esme watched his face, bent over his work, giving nothing away, and she felt the by now automatic response of her soul going on alert. This happens to ministers, she'd discovered. There is a professional interest that sends a shaft down into the fabric of a minister's being as tenacious as a dandelion root. Why don't you come in? She asked, with what she hoped was a casual air. Jabez smiled at the transparency of her proselytising, but continued to concentrate on resetting the gap, using his thumbnail as a gauge as he replaced the clean plugs. He dusted the terminals, brushed them lightly with his sandpaper, and refitted the high-tension lead. Because I don't like the church, he said. Esme watched him as he checked and blew clean the carburettor jets before he began to reassemble the filter. She liked the composure and focus of his face as he worked. But you believe in God? She ventured. He glanced up at her momentarily. I believe... He hesitated, searching for the words to say what he wanted. He turned aside and reached for the sump plug, replaced it. You've got to make sure this is tight. He paused in what he was doing and rested his weight forward on his knees on the stone flags of the yard. I believe in the stories you hear of people who died and were resuscitated. Those stories about a long tunnel leading up to the light. And the light is full of love and truth. I believe that. Light that sears and light that dances, exquisite to take your breath away, blinding bright. Light that could cut like a laser, but also nourish and heal and clean like sunshine. I believe in that. And that one day I will find my way home there. Or maybe not. Is that God? What I believe in? Esme stared at him. Jabez, that's beautiful. Irritation twitched somewhere in his look because he hadn't meant beauty. He'd meant truth. You ready to help me with this blade then? He said, reaching down for it without looking at her, getting to his feet again and crossing the yard. He showed her how he wanted her to turn the handle on the grindstone that revolved in a water bath supported by a cast iron frame. And as she did so, he held the blade against it for sharpening. But it doesn't matter what I believe. I still don't like the church, he said, with a sort of stillness of determination that Esme guessed ran very deep. Did we hurt you? She asked gently. She hoped her tone sounded ingenuous. It wouldn't do to let him know she'd had the gossip of several church members about him, but she wanted to know about his wife and what it was the prayer group had done to upset him. Jabez looked suddenly very tired. Sharing his soul had become unfamiliar. He felt unsure about this intrusion. That's fine, you can stop, he remarked as he lifted the blade and turned back to the lawnmower again. Esme wondered if her question would be left unanswered, but as Jabez knelt to reposition the blade on the mower, he glanced at her narrowly from under the wiry silver eyebrows, saying, I think you may know a bit more about me than you pretend. That moment was a crossroads for them. Esme had to decide then whether she wanted Jabez to be an acquaintance or a friend, whether she was to be the minister of the chapel with him or just herself, Esme. It is understood that a pastoral relationship is without the quality of truthfulness that a friendship has. The transactions between ministers and their flocks are ritualised. There are expectations and therefore pretences. This is understood and part of the world of formal relationships undertaken by people in the public eye. But a friend approaches barefoot with needs as unadorned as a beggar's bowl or the gift of self, like a flower held in the hand. She might have stayed as a minister then, evaded his rebuke with a joke, retreated to safe footing. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to intrude. Esme knew it was possible to make comments of that sort in just such a tone as to imply the other is prickly, oversensitive. There was no need to admit one's own dishonesty. She might have taken that course, but in her few years as a minister, she had learned to know how rare a thing it is to be offered the chance to be truthful. Reality is always so demanding. Not many attempt its rigours. Jabez refitted the blade as she considered this and tightened the nut with his key, afterwards slipping it into his pocket. Yes, I do know a bit about you already. Esme felt ashamed as she said it. I've asked several people about you. I know you were married and that your wife died and that something happened there to do with our chapel prayer group. I wanted to find out about it. Just nosy, I suppose. It's none of my business. I'm sorry, Jabez. And as simply as that, they crossed over into friendship. His offer of truthfulness and her shamed acceptance. Esme thought later, what slight moments are the occasions of human transformation. Jabez sat down beside the lawnmower and felt in the pocket of his jacket for a tin of tobacco, inside which were also cigarette papers. He rolled a cigarette, carefully, very thin, and patted his pockets to locate the matches with which to light it. Esme sat on the edge of the wooden chair again and waited for what he would say. Recovery time needed, it seemed. He drew on the cigarette. "My wife, Maeve," he said, affecting a hard and matter-of-fact tone, "died of cancer." He paused and looked suspiciously at his cigarette, and with good reason, because it had gone out. Esme waited while he relit it. He drew on it, looked at it, and flashed her one quick glance. It was awful, horrible. She lost her hair, and she had a lot of pain. Her arms swelled, and her medicines made her sick, desperately sick, and her belly filled up with fluid. And she smelled bad, and she knew she did. And she got so thin, she looked as though her teeth didn't belong in her face anymore. She wanted to stay here, so I nursed her. He stopped. Esme waited. He drew on the cigarette, relit it because it was out again. Esme waited. And then we were clutching at straws, I think. Someone from the chapel. He did not look at her, but gazed steadfastly ahead at nothing. Asked if a group of them could come to the cottage and pray for Maeve and me. I don't know what possessed me to agree to it, but, well, perhaps you can imagine. We were short on hope. He stopped speaking for a moment, his face set and still, remembering. So they came. Here in our cottage they came. Not Miss Trigg, she isn't into all that, but a woman that twittered, and a woman with a silent, enigmatic smile, and a man who stood too close when he talked to me, and a little bald bloke who was deaf, to pray for Maeve and me. Maybe you know them, I don't. I haven't been to chapel for years. And I think a lot of those who worship there now aren't the old ones, but run out from South Harbour to keep it from closing down. Anyway, they said, could they lay hands on her for healing? And she wanted it, so I said yes. I didn't want to raise Maeve's hopes, but, you know, her eyes that have been so dull and enduring suddenly looked alive again. I felt angry and helpless because I knew it would be no good, but I went along with it. I helped her into a chair in the middle of the room, and the four of them jostled round her into a group with their 8 hands plastered on her thin wasted shoulders and her poor bald head. A bit excessive. And then they started to pray. Do you know the kind of thing? They still do it. Lord, send your spirit, Lord, to heal and bless her, Lord. Make her free from pain, Lord, blah, blah, blah. He drew on his cigarette. It was out. He didn't bother to relight it, but let his hand come down to rest on his knee. He glanced at Esme, but only for a moment. I remember it sinking in. with such appalling clarity that Maeve was going to die. I hadn't really faced it until then, till I heard their church speak, full of unreality, and realised what reality held for us. I was standing by the table, an onlooker, trying to get under control the grief that was suddenly going crazy inside me. I was trying to put it on one side to deal with later. When the deaf man must have found his moment to get a prayer in edgeways, because he startled me by booming like a foghorn. I mean, really in capital letters. "Oh Lord, we pray for Mauve." And it was at that moment that I lost it all. To that extent, I suppose, he prayed with power, because his prayer certainly had an effect on me. Mauve. Inside me, it all muddled up together. All at once, something laughed, and something wept, and something died. Apart from her funeral, and sitting eavesdropping in the porch some Sundays, I never go near chapel nor church. Well, to be fair, I hadn't anyway, not for years. A brief, wry grin twisted his face. You'd have been proud of me, though. I made them a cup of tea before they went, and I gave them a biscuit. The desolation of this story moved in the centre of Esme's soul. She felt the sharpness of its anguish and was at a loss what to say. After a moment, "What did Maeve think of the prayer?" she asked. "Did she find it helpful?" Jabez nodded slowly. She did. She did. But she died. He looked thoughtfully at the lifeless remains of his cigarette in his hand and flicked it back over his shoulder in the direction of the orchard grass that grew down to meet the flags of the yard. "Esme, I don't like the church. I don't like its hypocrisy and its need to be right and to control everybody. It works by fear and manipulation and doublespeak, and to be honest, I got no time for it at all. Now, if you'll excuse me." He got up and lifted the lawnmower into the back of his truck and fetched a can to decant the used oil for recycling. "I must take this mower down the road to Mr. Griffith's before the afternoon's over. It was nice to see you." There was a definite dismissal in his tone that went beyond the requirement of the afternoon's tasks. Esme stood up and straightened her skirt. She looked at him, but he didn't meet her gaze. "Am I a part of all that, then?" she asked. "The church?" His eyes flickered, and he stood looking down at the metal can in his hand, slowly screwing down the cap. "Well, yes," he said quietly. "I guess you are." Esme felt a sharp pain of disappointment. The moment of honesty that brought intimacy between them seemed to have been lost, and the clarity between them had slipped away, leaving them back as they were, little more than strangers. "But it's still okay to come here." "Leave it, Esme," a voice inside her warned, but somehow she couldn't leave it. She had to be sure. He sighed impatiently. "I run a business here," he said, adding with a quick glance around his yard an involuntary laugh, if I may be permitted to dignify it by calling it that. "Anyone can call in any time. You asked to see how bikes are maintained. That's all right. Apparently you're interested in lawnmowers too. As far as it goes, that's all fine. But look, I'm not a mission field. Can we be clear on that?" Esme felt her colour rise. He was denying the pure truth that had shone between them, and she felt belittled and shut out by the way he spoke. "Most certainly," she shot back defensively. "You make yourself perfectly clear. I won't hold you up any longer." She left very swiftly, without looking back. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. Gosh, that's not a good moment to leave a story, is it? Oh dear. I hope they'll be all right. And I hope you're all right. How do you navigate your way through conflict? Do you find it difficult? Are you somebody who runs from antagonism and arguments? Are you somebody to soothe things down? Or are you somebody who insists and wants to push it through and get to what you see as the truth in the situation? Or does it depend who you're talking to? I don't like conflict. There are some people I refuse to be even in the same room with because they are so very antagonistic. I just like things peaceful in my life. It has become a priority for me. And I can't have it if it isn't peaceful. That's the end. How about you? There are different priorities, aren't there? Of love, of truth, of peace, of kindness. What are your ordering of priorities in the relationships in your life? Lord Jesus, you made it abundantly clear to us that your priority was love, and that's what ours must be if we want to travel with you. And I confess that for me sometimes peace is a greater priority than love. Teach me, Lord Jesus, to walk in your way and to learn from you, to accept your order of priorities, and to make the peace I crave be about love. Amen. How's your day going? I hope this is a good day. Peace to you. May there be some quietness in this day. May there be moments of pure contentment. Go well. God be with you. Peace to your day.